The world gasped when the news broke, a collective shudder that rippled through the hills of Hollywood and beyond. When Nick Reiner was arrested in connection with the brutal murder of his biological parents, the legendary director Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle. The initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed immediately by a frantic search for answers. In the vacuum of silence left by the tragedy, the online community began to do what detectives could not. They started digging into the past, piecing together a macabre puzzle from fragments that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. As thousands of eyes scoured the digital archives, a terrifying realization took hold. The signs of this catastrophe hadn't just appeared overnight. They had been broadcasting on a loop since 2016. Videos that once seemed like harmless, angst-filled promotional clips for a movie suddenly transformed into the haunting shadows of belated warnings, casting a long, dark silhouette over the present day. One particular recording from 2016 stands out as the first chilling tremor of the earthquake to come. In the footage, a younger Nick Reiner is captured in a moment of casual cruelty that freezes the blood of anyone watching in the post-2025 world. He is heard threatening to kill a dog, his voice devoid of the usual heat of anger simply because the animal barked a few times. It wasn't a tantrum, it was a cold calculation. Immediately following this disturbing declaration, Nick offered a glimpse into his internal machinery, admitting with a shrug that he had sick thoughts that he needed to go out and gather. At the time, amidst the chaotic promotional tour for the film Being Charlie, this statement was brushed aside, treated as the edgy, dark humor of a recovering addict trying to find his footing. But now, viewing that clip through the lens of a double homicide, it no longer sounds like a joke. It sounds like a confession. It sounds like an ignored alarm bell, ringing in an empty room, signaling a lack of empathy and a deep-seated darkness that was already festering beneath the surface, waiting for the dam to break. The tragedy isn't just what happened in December 2025. It is the realization that the script for this nightmare was being written out loud, line by line, years before the final act ever took place. If the first glimpse into Nick Reiner's psyche was a startling alarm, the subsequent footage that resurfaced from the promotional diaries of Being Charlie served as a descent into a completely fractured reality. The video, filmed in 2016, was intended to be a raw documentary-style look at a life in recovery. But today, it plays like a prelude to inevitable destruction. The camera follows Nick as he wanders through the luxurious, manicured streets of Brentwood, a neighborhood defined by its serenity and perfectly trimmed trees. Yet the figure moving through this paradise is anything but peaceful. Nick appears with hollow eyes and a disturbingly calm voice, looking less like a resident and more like a ghost haunting his own life, standing precariously at the razor's edge between lucidity and an inescapable mental breakdown. It is here that he delivers a line that, in the wake of the 2025 tragedy, sends a collective shiver down the spine of the internet. With a cadence that sounds almost like a twisted nursery rhyme, he mutters, "Because I'm a snail, and I will never fail. And, you know what? You'll have to bail me out of jail." At the time it was dismissed as the nonsensical rambling of a young man high on his own eccentricity, a bizarre joke lost in translation. But in hindsight, those words resonate as a distorted prophecy, a sentence spoken in a trance state that Nick himself may not have fully understood yet, one that predicted his final destination with terrifying accuracy. The footage grows darker as the veneer of the promotional tour strips away. When asked to simply state his name for the camera, a standard grounding question, Nick responds with defiant arrogance mixed with the paranoia. He refuses to identify himself, claiming, "Most people know me," hinting at an ego that was swelling beyond control, detaching him from the societal ties that bind us to reality. The scene shifts to show him with his sister Romy, smoking cannabis and laughing. But the laughter is hollow, echoing in a room where frames of the video inadvertently capture unexplained white powder, a subtle visual cue of the chaos lurking off-screen. Amidst this haze, Nick drops a raw, blunt confession that cuts through the noise. "I have a severe personality disorder." It was a moment of rare, brutal honesty, a diagnosis thrown out into the world that no one knew how to catch. The darkness solidifies seconds later when a dog interrupts the filming. For the second time, Nick's reaction is instant and lethal. "I will go kill that dog," he says. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't scream. The terror lies in his calmness. In this fictionalized world of filmmaking, his words were interpreted as character acting, but we now see them as the crumbling of moral boundaries. While the film Being Charlie was being celebrated globally as a redemptive effort, a story of hope and recovery, the real-life cracks were widening in the shadows, masked by the glamour of Hollywood and the blinding hope of a family that didn't see the cliff edge until they had already fallen over it. If the solo recordings were a window into a mind fracturing in isolation, the joint appearances with his father served as a heartbreaking public autopsy of a relationship that was already dead on arrival. In a 2016 interview for the AOL Build series, ostensibly to promote their collaborative film, the contrast between father and son was so painfully sharp, it felt less like a conversation and more like a collision of two different worlds. Rob Reiner sat with the open, eager posture of a man desperately trying to bridge a chasm, his body angled toward his son, his eyes locked on Nick with a protective, almost pleading intensity. He spoke at length, explaining their journey, his voice softening every time he mentioned Nick's name, as if the sheer force of his paternal affection could rewrite the history of their pain. He did not hesitate to declare to the cameras and to the world that his son was the person he loved most, a vulnerable admission, suggesting that every professional triumph in his legendary career paled in comparison to the safety of his child. But beside him, the response was a silence so loud it drowned out the applause. Nick sat cold and withdrawn, a statue of indifference carved from resentment. He answered questions in a flat, monotone voice, his gaze staring straight ahead or skimming past the interviewer, rarely, if ever, meeting his father's eyes. It was an empty, unreadable look that conveyed a distance measured not in inches, but in light years. When the host probed into the roots of their father-son dynamic, hoping for a heartwarming anecdote about growing up in a Hollywood dynasty, Nick dismantled the illusion with a single surgical sentence: "We didn't connect much when I was young." That was it. No elaboration, no nostalgia, no emotion. The room hung in an awkward suspension as Rob, sitting beside him, seemed to physically shrink his attempt to fill the void, his son left behind, falling flat against Nick's wall of ice. Nick went on to reveal the staggering statistic of his struggle: 18 stints in rehab, a number that speaks to a crushing cycle of failure and force. He spoke of drugs not as a hedonistic pursuit of pleasure, but as a necessary weapon to kill the noise, the chaotic sound born from the immense pressure of the Reiner lineage and his own deep-seated insecurities. In a tragic twist of irony, Rob admitted in that same interview, perhaps too late, that he had erred in trusting cold professionals and rigid institutions rather than listening to his own parental instinct, inadvertently turning his care into a chain of punishment upon his son's soul. Yet even this confession, this public act of contrition from a father to a son, failed to elicit a flicker of warmth from Nick. He remained brutally candid, warning the host with a chilling detachment that beneath his calm facade lay a crazy nature that no one would want to set off. It was a warning that went unheeded, a signal that the connection they were performing for the public was merely a brief, fragile pause in a prolonged war of attrition, where one man was fighting for love and the other was simply waiting for the inevitable explosion. The tragedy of the Reiner family was not just that they failed to connect, but that they tried to monetize their trauma in the hopes that art would heal the wound. The promotional tour for Being Charlie became a theater of the absurd, where the painful reality of their lives was packaged for consumption, and in doing so, the rift between them was laid bare for anyone willing to look closely. In yet another 2016 interview, the disconnect morphed from emotional distance into something far more clinical and disturbing. Nick Reiner appeared from the first seconds with a strangely stiff posture, his arms either crossed tightly over his chest or resting lifelessly in his lap, as if he were physically locking himself away from the environment. A quiet chill radiated from him, subtle yet unmistakable, an invisible barrier that repelled any attempt at genuine interaction. When the interviewer asked the inevitable question about the difficulty of turning his own painful addiction into a movie starring his father, Nick's response was terrifyingly banal. Not too difficult for me. It was a fairly pleasant experience. I didn't really find it hard, he replied. He spoke the words like he was reading a weather report, his gaze drifting downward, interspersed with strange, halting pauses, as if he were manually processing the language. There was no smile, no gesture of camaraderie, only a prolonged, echoing emptiness. To the observer, Nick appeared less like a participant in his own life story and more like an emotional tourist viewing the wreckage of his past, not with pain, but with the detached curiosity of a stranger. Beside him, Rob Reiner was painfully sincere, admitting almost bitterly that he had once blindly trusted anyone with a desk and a degree, inadvertently subjecting his son to punishments disguised as tough love. He humbled himself publicly, saying, "I should have stayed quiet and listened to him. He understood this better than I did." It was a rare, cutting confession from a father realizing his mistakes in real time. Yet, despite this emotional disclosure, Nick remained chillingly indifferent. He showed no reaction to his father's remorse, no softening of his gaze. Through Nick's lens, their father-son relationship seemed to exist only within structured, transactional confines, a business deal with clear beginnings and ends. While Rob clung to cinema as a bonding glue, calling Nick the heart and soul of the film, Nick's response was a slight nod, a brief reply, as if he were too exhausted to carry the weight of the family's expectations. He used dark humor, not as a bridge, but as a shield, describing the absurdities of rehab with a detached tone. "It's like seeing who goes first, heroin or the hooker." He sought not pity, but release. Using raw lines in the script was his form of sweet revenge on his past, a way to laugh at the pain before it could crush him. But under the studio lights, the cracks were visible, restless hands, avoidance of eye contact, fleeting forced smiles. Nick tried to appear part of the film crew, but inside he remained a child, trapped in cold rehab rooms where time had stopped and no amount of action or cut could restart it. If the videos from 2016 made viewers recoil at the potential for darkness, the footage captured in December 2025 froze them with the reality of it. We fast forward 9 years, bypassing the hidden decay to land directly in the aftermath of the unthinkable. 2 horrifying hours after the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, surveillance cameras at a gas station convenience store recorded a scene that is terrifying not for its violence, but for its absolute banality. Nick Reiner walked into the store wearing a black and green jacket with white stripes, a baseball cap pulled low, and a bright red backpack slung casually over one shoulder. There was no blood-soaked frenzy, no frantic looking over the shoulder. He moved through the aisles with the leisurely pace of a man on a late-night snack run, stopping to select a sports drink and patiently queuing for the checkout. He paid with a credit card and exchanged brief, polite pleasantries with the cashier. Later, that employee would recall that he looked entirely normal, a chilling testament to the fact that a monster can wear the face of a polite customer just moments after committing a double parricide. He walked out and stood on the street corner, waiting in the quiet night, as if he had nowhere left to go. When the silence was finally shattered at 9:15 p.m. by the screech of tires and the blinding strobe of red and blue lights from 4 LAPD patrol cars, the atmosphere shifted instantly from mundane to critical. Yet Nick did not run. He stood under the harsh, fluorescent glow of the gas station canopy, raising his hands as ordered, his eyes vacant and resigned. He looked less like a captured fugitive and more like a man who had been waiting for this exact moment for a decade. The cold composure he maintained during his arrest followed him days later into the Los Angeles Superior Court. On December 17th, 2025, Nick made his first public appearance, facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was wheeled in behind a glass partition, clad in a thick blue anti-suicide smock, with no shirt underneath his hands and legs shackled. He sat slightly hunched, his body rigid, staring straight ahead with the blinking frequency of a statue. As the severe indictment was read, charges that carried the weight of life in prison, or worse, he showed no tremor, no tears, no bowing of the head. It wasn't calm. It was an emotional void, a deep, expansive silence that sucked the air out of the courtroom. When the judge asked if he understood his rights, the man who once rhymed about being a snail delivered his only public words, "Yes, Your Honor." 3 words spoken in a monotone, flat frequency. That was all. He did not enter a plea. He did not look for a friendly face in the gallery. He simply sat there, a hollow vessel stripped of all humanity, letting the legal machinery grind into motion around him as if the proceedings concerned a stranger, cementing the image of a man who had not just killed his parents, but had long ago killed the part of himself that could feel anything at all. But to truly understand the mechanics of this tragedy, one must look beyond the coldness of the act and into the suffocating heat of the motive. In the search for a reason why society often looks for neglect, for abuse, for the absence of love. In the case of Nick Reiner, the terrifying truth revealed in his past interviews is that the catalyst was the exact opposite. In a video that now serves as a psychological key to the crime, Nick spoke about his addiction and rehabilitation, not with the anger of the abandoned, but with the smoldering resentment of the trapped. He revealed that his multiple stints in rehab were rarely acts of personal will, but rather mandates imposed by parents who loved him too much to let him fall. This is where the narrative twists into a dark paradox. Love became an invisible cage. Nick admitted that deep down he knew his parents were always present, always watching, always caring. But that constant hovering concern suppressed the vital parts of his identity, particularly his music, which he described not merely as a hobby, but as a survival instinct. When that creative outlet was stifled by the rigid structures of treatment and parental oversight, Nick felt he was being stripped of his breath. He candidly stated that it was his parents' mistake, not because they didn't love him, but because they didn't trust that he could stand or even fail on his own. That lack of trust masked as protective concern left him feeling perpetually weak, a broken object that needed to be fixed, rather than a human being who needed to be heard. At one point in the footage, the conflict within him spills out in a frantic, contradictory stream of consciousness. He rushes to say, "I'm lucky to have parents who care about me," as if reciting a line he knows he should feel. But immediately, the facade cracks, and he admits the darker truth. "But every time I used drugs, I felt terrible guilt." He described the sensation almost in a whisper, saying, "I think right now they must be thinking about me." This wasn't the fear of police or death. It was the paralyzing fear of disappointing the two people who had built their lives around saving him. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said, "I want peace." The tragedy lies in his twisted logic. The love that was meant to be a lifeline fell to him like a noose. It didn't pull him out of the darkness. It only deepened his guilt and self-incrimination, creating a pressure cooker of obligation, where the only escape from the burden of being the beloved son was to destroy the source of that love entirely. The final piece of this tragic puzzle comes not from a cold interview room, but from the warmth of the family dining table, offering a glimpse into the days immediately preceding the horror, a glimpse that makes the outcome even more incomprehensible. Barry, a close family friend who stayed at the Reiner estate for 5 days, just before the murders, paints a picture of a family that was not at war, but in a state of deceptive, idyllic peace. He recalls a 32-year-old Nick Reiner who appeared healthy, sober, and fully present. There were no shouts, no manic episodes. Instead, there were traditional family dinners, games of tennis and basketball, and the mundane domestic rhythms of a son taking out the trash and washing dishes. To the outside observer, it was the portrait of a family healed. Yet, Barry's retrospective analysis offers the most haunting insight of all. He noted that the most confusing aspect was not an absence of affection, but an excess of it. There was too much love, he observed, but it didn't match. He witnessed Rob and Michelle trying a million different ways to save their son, providing the best treatment money could buy, never abandoning him, never giving up hope. But the tragedy lies in the fact that this unshakable love was hitting a wall. The warm family meals and the peaceful evenings watching TV were not signs of recovery. They were the calm eye of a hurricane that had already formed. Rob Reiner's love was real, but it was powerless against the silent drift of a mind slipping into its own darkness. The normalcy Barry witnessed was merely a fragile shell, a temporary performance of sanity before the final collapse. Looking back at this collection of videos, from the casual threats against a dog in 2016 to the chillingly empty "Yes, Your Honor" in 2025, we are left with a terrifying picture of silent danger. It wasn't the explosive anger or the loud fights that signaled the end. It was the prolonged withdrawal, the emotional freezing, and the way a young man spoke about his own life as if reading a stranger's obituary. The signs were there in the dead eyes, the flat affect, and the cold logic of a distorted mind broadcasting on a frequency that those closest to him, blinded by love, could not tune into until it was too late. As we stare into the void left by this case, we are forced to ask ourselves, what is the most overlooked warning sign? Is it the silence, the isolation, or the moment a person stops connecting with their own pain? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes naming these shadows is the only way to prevent them from consuming another family. This is the story of Nick Reiner, a tragedy written in invisible ink for 9 years, finally revealed in blood.